America, a land vast and breathtaking. A place built on the idea of freedom, ambition, and limitless possibility. But no story about this country can begin honestly without naming the ground beneath our feet. This is stolen land, and from that theft grew a contradiction so deep it still bleeds. The conquest of America began with Europeans, and the privileges they carried followed them. But when a black or brown person moves with the same confidence, the same hunger, the same excellence, suddenly the rules change, especially if they don't just compete, but win. Then comes the punishment. Then comes the reminder. Then comes the insistence that there is a place, and it is not at the top. This is a nation built by taking what was never given. Yet it criminalized a black man for taking only what he earned, fairly, publicly, and with his own hands. This is the story of a man who shattered that hypocrisy in plain sight. A man who refused to bow, refused to apologize, refused to shrink. This is the story of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was never just a fighter. He was a strategist, a reader of men, a master tactician playing chess inside a sport that celebrated brute force. At the dawn of the 20th century, the heavyweight championship was protected like a private estate. Officially, it was called the color line. Unofficially, it was a whites-only country club, designed to keep the title powerful, symbolic, and unreachable. But Jack Johnson did not believe in invisible fences. While white champions claimed they were the best in the world, Johnson followed the truth. Across oceans, across borders, across excuses. He chased the reigning champion, Tommy Burns, from continent to continent, forcing the question no one wanted asked. If you are truly the greatest, why are you running? Burns agreed to fight only when the world was watching from far away, believing distance might soften the outcome. In 1908, in Sydney, Australia, the illusion finally met reality. What happened in the ring was not a contest, it was a lesson. Johnson smiled, he talked, he leaned on the ropes, he dismantled the so-called champion piece by piece with patience and precision. At times, he seemed less concerned with winning than with proving a point. And when the fight was finally stopped, something larger collapsed with it. Jack Johnson did not just take a title that night. He destroyed a myth. He humiliated the idea that supremacy could be inherited rather than earned. The heavyweight crown now belonged to a black man, and America would never forgive him for it. In 1910, the heavyweight championship was more than a belt. It was a symbol, a public assurance that the racial hierarchy of the modern world was intact, that white dominance was not just cultural, but biological. When Jack Johnson claimed that title, he didn't merely win a fight, he shattered a belief system. The response was immediate. Newspapers howled, politicians panicked. White America experienced something close to collective shock. The idea that a black man could stand unchallenged at the top of anything, let alone the most violent, masculine sport on earth, was intolerable. So the search began for a correction, for restoration, for a savior. They pulled Jim Jeffries out of retirement, an undefeated former champion living quietly on a farm. The press gave him a name that would echo through history, the Great White Hope. Jeffries accepted the role openly. He said he was fighting to prove that the white man was superior. On July 4, 1910, in Reno, Nevada, a stadium was built in the desert for a single purpose. The atmosphere was electric with expectation and fear, but when the bell rang, mythology offered no protection. Johnson controlled the fight from the start. He laughed, he talked, he held back, not out of mercy but to extend the lesson. Round after round, he dismantled Jeffries with precision, turning the symbol of salvation into a public unraveling. By the 15th round, the Great White Hope was collapsing to the canvas. What followed was not reconciliation, it was violence. That night, riots erupted across the United States. Black communities were attacked in dozens of cities, not because Jack Johnson had lost, but because he had won too completely. America had demanded proof, and it could not survive the answer. If defeating white champions was seen as an insult, then the way Jack Johnson lived was viewed as a provocation. At a time when a black man was expected to lower his eyes, to step off the sidewalk and make himself small. Johnson did the opposite. He drove custom-built race cars. He wore furs and diamonds. He opened his own nightclub, the Café de Champion, where black and white patrons drank together under the same roof. He refused humility. He refused invisibility. But what truly unsettled the establishment was not the wealth. America had seen successful black men before, so long as they stayed discreet. What they could not accept was the defiance, and nothing symbolized that defiance more than the women. Jack Johnson did not merely associate with white women. He loved them. He married them. He walked beside them through the front doors of the finest hotels, in full view of a society built on racial separation. To white America, this was not a personal choice. It was a transgression of the deepest taboo. These women were seen as property. And Johnson, once again, was cast as a thief. They could not defeat him in the ring. They could not intimidate him into silence. So they chose another weapon. If fists had failed, the law would finish the job. When no man could stand before him in the ring, the establishment changed the battlefield. They reached for a weapon Jack Johnson could not punch. The Mann Act, a law written to stop human trafficking, was bent into a tool of discipline, aimed squarely at Jack Johnson. He was accused of transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. The immorality was never in doubt. She was white, and she was with him. The verdict was inevitable. The trial was theater, and the punishment was exile. Johnson fled the United States to avoid imprisonment, forced to live abroad while his country hunted him from a distance. He settled primarily in France, moving through Spain, United Kingdom, and parts of the Americas, fighting when he could, surviving when he had to. His title was stripped, his earning years were stolen, his greatness was intentionally dimmed. This was not justice, it was containment. They wanted to break him, to make an example of him, to remind the world what happens when a black man refuses to stay in the place assigned to him. But even this failed. They could exile his body. They could cage him when he returned. They could never undo what he had already proven. Jack Johnson stands not as a cautionary tale, but as a monument to defiance, to excellence, to a man who never waited for permission to be free. He simply lived as if he already was. History didn't end with Jack Johnson. The law that was used to silence him didn't disappear either. The Mann Act outlived its most infamous victim, and in the decades that followed, it was applied very differently, sometimes unjustly, sometimes exactly as intended. Men like Chuck Berry were pursued under the same statute, in cases where race, fear, and spectacle once again blurred the line between justice and punishment. In those moments, the shadow of Jack Johnson lingered. But history also makes distinctions. When the Mann Act was later used against R. Kelly or against Sean Combs, it was not policing defiance or love. It was addressing allegations of coercion, abuse, and exploitation. These cases are not echoes of Jack Johnson. They are reminders that a law can be both weaponized and necessary. The difference matters, and history demands we say so clearly. As for Jack Johnson, his punishment followed him long after the cheers faded. After years of exile in Europe, he returned to the United States in 1920 and served time in prison. His career never recovered. He lived the remainder of his life moving between exhibitions, business ventures, and public memory. Still watched, still judged, still unrepentant. He died in 1946, far from the glory that once terrified a nation. He was married. He had no surviving children, and his death was sudden, but his life had never been quiet. For more than a century, America offered no apology. Then in 2018, Jack Johnson was granted a posthumous presidential pardon. It did not restore his stolen years. It did not erase the exile or the damage, but it did something rare. It admitted, too late, that the conviction was wrong. Jack Johnson never asked to be a symbol. He simply refused to pretend he was less than he was. And his story doesn't end here. Because the crime at the heart of this story, the policing of belonging, the punishment for crossing invisible lines, did not stop in America, and it did not stop in the 20th century. Next, we travel far from this ring, to another nation, another identity, another question quietly burning at the center of power. Who gets to belong, and who decides? Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, Jack Johnson never asked for permission to be free.